It is August 22nd, 2017. This is Ashton Ellett with Two Party Georgia, an oral history program sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. We're here in Rome with Mr. Frank Barron. Thank you for participating. Thank you for being part of the Two Party Georgia program.
Delighted to be here.
Thank you, Mr. Barron. So if you would, go ahead and give everybody sort of the 30-second, 1-minute biography of Mr. Frank Barron.
Well, my name is Frank Barron. I was born and raised in Rome, Georgia, back in 1931, and I have lived here all of my life, excusing 4 years in college and 3.5 years in the Navy. I grew up in Rome, attended local schools, graduated from Darlington School in 1948, and then spent 4 great years at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia, graduating in 1952. That was during the high days of the Korean War, and so I went into Navy OCS and graduated and served 3 years on a destroyer in the Pacific, which I consider one of the highlights of my life. When I got out of the Navy, I came back to Rome to go in the Coca-Cola bottling business, which was a family business. I stayed in that business. We acquired Valdosta and Fort Valley, along with Rome and Cedartown, Carrollton, Cartersville, and Fort Valley plants, which we owned as a group. I worked in those, got married in 1957, had 2 children, Frank III, who is an airline pilot, and Rebecca, who is a housewife. She did teach school for a while. She lives in Rome. Frank lives in Florida. In 1986, we sold all of our Coca-Cola plants to the Coca-Cola Company. And since that time, I have, I guess, occupied myself with good works, perhaps might be one way to put it. I'm not so sure how good they've been, but I've had a very interesting life, and I'm here ready to answer your questions.
So how did the Barrons end up in Rome, here in Floyd County?
Well, the Barron family really emanated out of Northern Ireland, and perhaps prior to that, Scotland. That came over in this country, as near as we can determine, around 1740 or 50. Probably came into Charlestown, now known as Charleston, South Carolina. They spread to the south. Some ended up in South Carolina, some ended up in Texas, but a great majority of them ended up in West Georgia, which was pretty pristine and unknown country in those days. My great-grandfather was a farmer up between Rome and Somerville, Georgia, and my grandfather was also what we referred to in North Georgia as a dirt farmer. He emanated to Rome, where he married in, I think, 1880 or 90, I'm not real sure. But in any case, my grandfather started a store, and the family lore has it that he went broke twice in the grocery store business, although I think he probably was modestly successful. And one of the great products that he sold was some Coca-Colas that bottled in Chattanooga, hauled down by a train somehow or another, and we don't know, the history doesn't tell us, by 1901, January the 10th, as a matter of fact, he started the Coca-Cola Company.
Now this is F.S. Barron?
This is F.S. Barron, Frank Smith Barron, in 1901, January the 10th. The record will also tell you that that was the 6th Coca-Cola plant in the world, after Chattanooga, Atlanta, Chicago, and 1 or 2 more. There's some variations on that because there were soft drink plants which later took on Coca-Cola, but basically Rome is held to be the 6th oldest Coca-Cola plant in the world. I served as the obligatory jobs as being in the Rotary Club, being president of the Chamber of Commerce, and being on the various school boards, and my biography in those fields is not a thing of any great interest and somewhat dull if I were to recount it. So I'll leave that for future historians to dig into.
So you've mentioned several towns in what was the old 7th Congressional District here in Northwest Georgia. Mm-hmm. Describe for me what sort of the economy, the culture of Northwest Georgia was like, you know, during your upbringing, during your professional life.
Well, the culture was that of poor farmer, cotton mill, foundry people. Rome was a foundry town. Rome was the subject of a great civil war, almost, I guess, near battle, because we were making cannons for the Confederacy. Somehow or another, Rome became a foundry town, and at one time, according to local historians, there were probably 6 or 8 foundries. And as a young man riding Coca-Cola trucks and routes and delivering Coca-Cola, I remember going into the foundries. There were at least 3 that I can remember that were still in business. The foundry business just morphed into nothing. The cotton mill business morphed into the carpet business, which was really nurtured and begun in Dalton, Georgia, as a result of the old Peacock Alley, they called it, where the tufted textile people had bathrobes and little placemats and things of that nature. That evolved into the carpet industry, which grew into Rome, which is very prominent in Rome and Calhoun and Dalton, of course, and not to mention Chatsworth and other towns. So Northwest Georgia, your reference as the old 7th Congressional District is correct. There was a great commonality that followed the route of old Georgia Highway 41, now Interstate 75.
So your family as Coca-Cola bottlers, you've referenced Chamber of Commerce, Rotary Club, which was a businessman's group. Tell us how you interacted with what politics meant to the Barron family, to somebody like you in the position that you held as the Coca-Cola bottler for Northwest Georgia.
Well, the Barron family always felt like in the Coca-Cola business, and understand we had plants scattered throughout Northwest Georgia. I mean, Dalton and Rome. We had Cedartown, a plant, Carrollton, and Cartersville, all in Northwest Georgia. The other plants in South Georgia, Valdosta and Fort Valley, came along later. But the theory was that growth was where our growth would come from, and that growth, of course, was industrial growth, and we felt like industrial growth was built on good economic and sound government practices of a community. I guess we could say that's true of the state. I guess we could say it was true of the country, but we couldn't control the state and we couldn't control the Washington, D.C., but we could have a little influence in the Daltons and the Romes and the Carrolltons and so forth. So were we interested, how we got interested in politics? It was a matter of, I won't exactly say it was greed, but it was, it morphed into more than that. We felt like proper growth of a community not only was going to help us in the long run, but it helped the community. I think everybody agreed then and now, you don't stand still. You're either going ahead or you're slipping backwards. And the way to do that was to have good politics, a sound economic system in your community. Again, we couldn't control the state, but we could sure make Rome be healthy. And so we were very active and took a position. You spoke in your introduction of a two-party system, or whatever. Of course, it was all Democrats in those days. The Republicans were from somewhere foreign to us, mostly north of here.
Well, I wanted to ask about Republicans in Rome, and there's a couple names that I came across in research to see if you knew any of these individuals. Wilson Hardy. Had you ever heard of Wilson M. Hardy?
You mean Squire Hardy?
I do.
You do. Mr. Hardy was president of what is still a very active and successful real estate company called Hardy Realty. Mr. Hardy was, if I had a mentor, he and Harold Clatfelter, who were Hardy Trust people, were my mentors. And I love that old man. He was great. We fished together years and years ago, back in the 60s. Now, Mr. Hardy probably weighed 118 pounds soaking wet. However, if you will go to the University of Georgia list of lettermen, you will find that Mr. Hardy was a letterman played in 1898, and he lettered on the University of Georgia football team. And he believed greatly in the University of Georgia, and he also believed in fishing. Now, Mr. Hardy grew up in the era when you wore a coat and tie everywhere you went. I fished in Apalachicola, Florida with Mr. Hardy more than once when he went fishing in a tie. He would put on a coat and tie. Mr. Hardy, we don't have to wear ties. Son, I've been wearing a tie every day of my life for 60 years and I'm not going to stop now. And he didn't. And he wore a surgical mask. Oh, yes, I knew Mr. Wilson Hardy very well. Lovely guy. Great guy.
He was actually, I believe, and I may be wrong on this, but he was actually a supporter of Wendell Willkie in 1940.
I wouldn't be surprised. He may have been. I don't know. I was only 8 years. No, I was 10 years, 12 years old, I guess.
There's another famous or infamous Roman, depending on his politics, Graham Wright.
I didn't know Mr. Graham Wright. Mr. Graham Wright, the Wright family, there was one that was a U.S. senator who actually, prior to the Civil War, went to Washington he was a U.S. senator, to negotiate a way to avoid what became the Civil War. He was a little bit out of step with most of his peers in Rome, but a very far-looking, far-sighted sort of man, and would that he had his way, maybe we could have avoided that great carnage. But now this was the Graham Wright you're talking about, his ancestor. Now, I didn't know Mr. Graham Wright, and I'm not real sure, but I think he probably was Barry Wright's father. And Barry, better known as Buck, who was a lawyer, also spent a term in the state legislature, I believe, sometime in the 50s, was a dear friend of mine.
Now here's a name you probably do have a bit more familiarity with, Ralph Ivy.
Ralph Ivy. Ralph Ivy lived up the street from me when I first got married. Ralph was not married at the time. He lived in Ms. Starr's boarding house, and Ralph with a bunch of other guys. And Ralph was known as a bit of a odd man because he was a Republican, and we didn't know much about that. And we would sit around the neighborhood, and on Saturday we'd walk up and down the street with an ice cold beverage of some description, hopefully a Coca-Cola, but more than likely not. And Ralph would be up there. He roomed with several more guys, and it was a very neighborly neighborhood. There were 2 or 3 more young married couples, and Ralph was a nice guy. His politics, he was about 2 times smarter than the rest of us, so we didn't know a lot of times what he was talking about. Remember him well.
So clearly, these gentlemen were the minority politically in Rome and in Northwest Georgia. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Why the attachment to the Democratic Party here in this part of the state, as well as elsewhere?
It's so easy to say the culture. Well, the culture is defined as a system of liking the way you live and imparting to your children how you live so that they will, in future years, live like you did. And that is called culture. The culture is that my daddy was a Democrat and everybody that was elected was a Democrat. The party lines, as we know them today, were very indistinct, as I recall, in my early days of being in business, late 50s, all 60s and 70s. I think it was later than that when we began to see the Republican tendencies toward economic reality versus the Democratic Party's sense of liberal things which had to do with welfare and that. As a business person, I think a lot of us thought Republican but voted Democratic because that was the only option we had. The shift came, of course, with Bo Calloway and later on, which is a whole nother subject.
So you mentioned your father, Willie Barron,
That's correct.
was a staunch Democrat.
I won't say he was a staunch Democrat. I think he was, like a great many businessmen of that era, we were not staunch as you would define them today. Today, you're almost, there were a lot of, they called them yellow dog Democrats. Mm-hmm. I'd vote for a yellow dog before I'd vote for a Republican. We weren't that way. I wouldn't be surprised if my father and some of his friends didn't vote for Wendell Willkie. I didn't understand at my age the nuances of what they were talking about. I do know that, for example, my father didn't like Social Security. And as I grew older and began to realize what Social Security was and was working and had a little tax knowledge and retirement thoughts and things like that, I said, Daddy, why do you oppose? His thought was, nobody's going to live long enough. Why are we putting all that money away? I remember one time, and I love to tell this, I'd been off to a Coca-Cola sponsored deal up at Harvard for a few weeks, and in our accounting, they came across with something that was known in those days as a profit sharing plan. And that meant you could put aside for management a whole lot of money, tax-free, and then when you retired, you could draw, and that's when you paid the taxes on the money. It was a probably unfair thing, but it was the law at the time. And I came back and I said to my father, I said, we need to talk about this. We need to establish, we had no established retirement plan for ourselves or our people. Our folks that work for us, we just, when they retired, we said, here's $100 a week or a month or whatever the number was, and that's your retirement. We just paid it. Nothing was invested, but in any case, he said, well, what would we do that for? And I said, well, when we retire, we can do this and it'd be a great tax advantage. He said, why would you retire? I said, well, Daddy, I'm 32 or whatever I was, and of course I knew an awfully lot then. It's gone downhill since then, but back then I knew a lot. Anyway, I said, Daddy, some of us don't want to work forever and ever and ever. And he was absolutely mystified. Why would you retire? And he never did. He was not well the last couple of years and had to have a driver to get him there, but in his mind, he wasn't retired. And I've thought about that a lot since. When he grew up, born in 1898, during the Depression, World War II, was in the Army briefly doing, World War I rather, excuse me, probably didn't expect to live past 65 years old. And so why would you retire? And so that was his attitude on that.
Well, so, as you mentioned, the party lines weren't as rigid as they are perhaps now in terms of partisan identification. So what was the relationship you or your father had with, say, Senator Russell or Senator George, and then the Talmadges of the
wasn't a very close relationship with Senator Walter George, as I recall. We knew who he was. He was the white-haired absolute gentleman legislator. Senator Dick Russell, was a sort of obese, balding, good old boy kind of fella from Winder, Georgia. The connection between Senator Russell and my family goes back to my great-grandfather over in Commerce, Georgia, which is a hop, skip, and jump away from Winder. My great-uncle was a guy named Dr. Lamartine Hardman, and he was governor of Georgia in 1925. And Senator Russell, 32 or 3 years old, having served term had been in the state legislature, ran for and was elected governor, I believe, in 1930 or 1930.
Yeah.
Right along there. Anyhow, the Russells and the Hardmans were great friends. They had some arguments, and so there was a family connection with Senator Russell. And when I went up to him and said, "Senator Russell, I'm Frank Barron from home." "Oh yeah, how's Willie? How's Mary Sue?" and all that. So I knew Senator Russell, even though he was a lot older than I, and I was just a young puppy out of the military and trying to learn how to do what my father and my uncle and others did so well, and that is become acquainted with, support, and understand the political system. I've always been a little bit critical of some of my friends who said, "Oh, I'm not going to fool with politics, it's all rotten." Well, fine, it's rotten because you let it be rotten. If you get out here and let's support good, honest folks like Senator Russell, you're going to see a whole different ball game. And I didn't, one more comment rather about your previous question about why did I get into politics.
Sure.
I just feel like it's a moral duty to be involved in it. I think it's fun. I think it's interesting. Sometimes it makes you mad as the devil. But you're entrusting the future of this country, whether it be a local county commissioner or whether it be President of the United States. Somewhere in there, a great many things that affect you are going to take place. Now, are you willing to just let anybody do it? A lot of my friends were, "Oh, I don't fool with politics. I don't like that." Well, fine. You're going to get what they want to give you. You better get in there. I feel very strongly about that. And I'm not what you would call a hard, dyed-in-the-wool Republican, but I am conservative and would probably, where I pin down, would say, yeah, I'm a Republican. But I'm not locked into anything. I don't belong to any political party, and I have studiously not sent them any money. Now, I've sent candidates money, but that's the...
So that begs the question. Has Georgia and Georgia voters changed, or has there just been sort of a partisan realignment where conservatives who used to support Democratic candidates now support Republican candidates?
My daddy used to say that there wasn't a thing in the world wrong with Rome, Georgia, that a couple of good fires and a few funerals wouldn't take care of. That's a little harsh way of putting it, but I had ancestors who absolutely remembered the Civil War. And I remember being in Athens, Georgia, and there was a great aunt or something. I don't even know which one she was, but I'd been told to go see her when I happened to be in Athens on something else one day. And when I mentioned the fact that my fraternity brother was from Pennsylvania, the words out of her mouth was, "Does your mother know this?" I thought, "Oh, yeah, I guess so." And it was much later in life I realized this lady had seen the Civil War. And she bore the wounds, mental or physical, I don't know. Well, when all those people, and we looked back and said, what was that foolishness about? Some of the rancor, which unfortunately is coming back again, but some of the rancor sort of went away. And I think when that happened, the people who had been staunch Republicans and or Democrats said, well, you know, what I guess maybe I'm looking for is a philosophy. And that sort of happened in the 70s, I'm thinking. And I think it had to do with the business community taking a stand against what they viewed as giveaways of money and irrational spending of the treasury that we hold in this country. And I'm somewhat of the view that still is the case today. I think we're spending a lot of money, and with a $3 trillion debt we've got now.
The debt, I believe, is around 19 trillion.
Is it 19 trillion? I think we're growing, but in any case, whatever it is, there's going to be a payday, and if we don't correct it, I mean, we just can't continue to borrow ourselves into prosperity. And it happens that, in my view, probably the Republicans are not the answer, but they may be better than the other crowd. And yet I think they're probably just as bad. I don't know what the solution is, but we've got to do something about the $19 trillion. If that's, once you get up above 30, 40 million, I sort of lose track. It doesn't.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the individuals. Since we were talking about parties sort of generally, you took your first position here at the Coca-Cola bottling in Rome, 1956. So that would have been Marvin Griffin's gubernatorial term. And just sort of, if you would, walk me through sort of your interactions with some of those different governors.
Marvin
Georgia.
Griffin would be a little bit early because I was mostly on a Coca-Cola truck from 6:30 in the morning till around 5, and with a brand new 2 little babies and a relatively new wife. I didn't have a lot of wiggle room time. I was in the Rotary Club, but that was about the extent of it. It was much later than, I say much later, it was some later. I don't remember having much of a thought about Marvin Griffin. I can tell you that the consensus seemed to be that this guy was a little bit on the shady side. I'm not sure that bothered me much because I kind of thought, this is the way it is. And if I were to really sit down and be honest, I would say to you that if we gave a donation to a political person, one of the issues of the day in our business was what they called a crown tax. That would be a tax on every bottle of Coca-Cola so that they could have money to take care of the broken bottles on the side of the road. Well, we didn't want that. And I guess we figured if we sent Marvin Griffin a donation, he would veto any legislation were it to come. Of course, the truth of the matter was, in the state of Georgia, you were not going to have anything that was anti-Coca-Cola because they had better lobbyists than me in Rome, Georgia. They had some real powerhouses down there fighting those things. But that would give you a little bit of an idea of the thinking. I think people in those days, and I won't advocate this kind of thinking, but I think people in the 50s and 60s were a little bit more tolerant of a powerful man doing something for himself. I think they just sort of figured, well, if he's going to pave the road in front of his farm out there, that's probably okay. I mean, the guy's catching the devil from all sides, and he's being hit up for this, that, and the other. And so if he wants to spend a few $1,000s and pave his road in front of his farm, that's probably not the worst thing that could happen. So some of those things which now would be so marginally perceived as wrong and are and were then would be issues. And people would jump up and down and say, you shouldn't do that. And of course, they're correct. And I don't, it's that old thing that has been oft discussed. You sort of had to be there to understand the tenor of the times and know how people felt. And so I have no great memory of Marvin Griffin except that he was considered a little bit on the shady side, but I had no strong opinions about him.
Well, that takes us up to Ernest Vandiver, Ernie Vandivers. Very, very transformative period in Georgia history, up from 1959 to early 60s. So he saw the massive resistance period, the beginnings of desegregation here in Georgia. Did you have any dealings, I suppose, with the Vandiver administration?
Well, it happens that Ernie Vandiver was a graduate of Darlington School, which is a prep school here in Rome, which I went to and served for many, many, many years. I don't even know how many on the board of that institution, and was honored by being outstanding alumnus one time, distinguished alumnus one year. So I have a very close connection to Darlington. Well, Ernie Vandiver was a graduate of Darlington. And while he was here, he met and married a niece of Senator Russell who went to Shorter. And I, for some reason or another, knew her, perhaps because so many Shorter girls stayed in Rome, my mother being one of them because she was of a different generation. So the Vandivers, and his best friend was a very close friend of mine, an insurance business guy named Billy Huffman. And so, yes, I won't say I was close friends to Ernie Vandiver because he's a good bit older than I, but I certainly knew him. And his widow serves on the Richard B. Russell Foundation today. And she's a lovely lady, and I guess I've known her for 60 years maybe. So yeah, this guy also, Ernie Vandiver, was probably the beginning of the we're straight arrow, we're transparent, and right is right, and there is no gray. It's either wrong or it's right, and I will conduct myself in that way. He was a segregationist, but I don't fault him for that. I think that were he alive and in that position today, he'd be an ardent integrationist. He would see the wrongness of it. But there again, you have to go back and say, what did people know and when did they know it? And in those days, you just didn't know it.
Moving on from Vandiver, you have Carl Sanders.
So another of the same, and a very dear friend of mine. I talked to Carl on the telephone, maybe 6 weeks, maybe longer than that, maybe a couple of months before he died. I saw him on television and wrote him on Carl Sanders thing. I thought Carl was just a great guy. And I was at the age where the new, young, rebellious throw the old guys out, and I was one of those guys. So I was a great Carl Sanders supporter. I just thought he was the young guy, not much older than I. He was the savior, and I found nothing to. And also, he's the guy who brought the university system in the day modern era and built all the caused to begin to be built or be built, the junior colleges, which are now part of the university system. Carl Sanders was a very forward-thinking guy, and I wrote him a note, and he called me up a few days later, and we had a nice visit laughing about some of the old characters, most of whom are dead now. Of course, Carl's dead now.
So you had sort of an outlier, we'll say, in Governor Lester Maddox. What do you think explained sort of Lester Maddox in 1966 historic election? You have Bo Calloway, who you mentioned earlier, actually putting up a fight in the general election.
Bo not only put up on a fight, he got more votes than Lester did. Lester was an enigma. I think all of us were embarrassed by, and that's the first time I ever supported a Republican.
I was going to ask.
Well, of course, it was the first time you had the opportunity to. Bo was a friend of mine, and I liked him. Bo was a smart guy, came from a fabulous, wealthy and generous and great family down at the Callaway Gardens in Lima. I supported Bo. I'm not sure I supported him as much as I should have, but we saw Lester Maddox with his pickricks and his axe handles. And I think that's when we all begin to say, what we're doing is not right, And what he's doing is so wrong that I think those of us who might have been classified 10 years earlier as segregationists, but I don't think we were segregationists as much as we were status quoists. Whatever it was, we said, you know, let's don't mess with it. Eventually it will go where it will go. So I don't think we were ardent before this, integrationists nor segregationists. I think we just said, let's don't do anything. But with Lester and the Pickwick and the Can, I think that's when most of us said, you know, this is not right. This is morally unacceptable. Let's go with Bo and let's get this thing straightened out. And of course, the interesting thing that happened, it's totally a surprise to us in the business community. The guy turned out to be the most pro-business governor we'd had in years, if ever. Lester was a businessman. He understood what the small business, and we were small business. I mean, you think Coca-Cola, they think we were big. We weren't. We were a bunch of little bitty businesses. Cartersville Coca-Cola probably didn't do $700,000 in a year. I mean, you know, and we thought that was very successful. But we were little businesses, and you multiply that across. I think he got a worse rap than he deserved, but he sure did deserve some. There's no question about that. But he was a good governor to the business community, and that's about all I can say.
Well, taking a step back, you know, you were talking about Bo Calloway and the business support that Bo Calloway received, especially out of Atlanta, and tie it into something else you were talking about with the lobbyists at Coca-Cola. Are you familiar with somebody named Ovid Davis?
Oh, Lord, yes. Ovid was a great friend of mine.
Coca-Cola's political operator.
He was the political genius. Ovid gave me some of the best advice I ever got about politics and how to handle myself. I just adored Ovid. He was, and there are people, secretaries down there in Atlanta, or at least were last time I was down there in the capital, that say, you know, I remember Mr. Ovid Davis. He knew everybody. He conducted himself honorably. He didn't mind opposing somebody if they disagreed with his philosophy. He was the best.
Well, to segue from Mr. Ovid Davis into sort of the conversation we were having, there's a letter of Mr. Davis's to Mr. Woodruff, telling him, he's like, here's a guy who is running for office. He's not going to have much of a political future. Let's go ahead and send him a check to help retire his debt. That person's name was Jimmy Carter. This was right after 1966, right after the primary with Ellis Arnold and Lester Maddox. But around comes 1970, and Mr. Carter didn't really quit campaigning between 66 and 70. You've already said you were a big supporter and friend of Governor Sanders. Do you have any memories of the 1970
Jimmy Carter?
The Carter-Sanders campaign?
Not really. I was a Carl Sanders guy, and Jimmy Carter came around. I remember he came to the Coca-Cola plant, and we always, as we did all the time, we let him go upstairs and talk to our salesman at 6:30 in the morning. And when they would do that, we knew they were serious. You got to understand with Ovid Davis, and you said something that triggered when you said Ovid sent him a check after he got beat. That's the advice he gave me. He said, Frank, the guy that gets beat, he's the guy that's down, and he says, he put this in a Christian point of view. It's almost a Christian thing to do. A guy that's beat probably is deep in debt, and furthermore, he didn't get elected. The guy's got a problem. You should see about those guys. Well, I remember this so well. About a year later, a fellow in Rome, John Adams was his name, was in the state legislature. And John was a friend of mine, about my age, a little bit younger. His daddy was sheriff, Joe Adams. And Johnny ran, and he got beat. And I can tell you where I was. I ran into Johnny a few weeks later, and I said, Johnny, how you doing? I'm sure sorry you got beat. I said, Johnny, do you owe some money? He says, yeah, I do. I said, I'm going to send you a little check because you ran the good race, but you got beat. Well, bless Pat, if he didn't come back 2 years later and get reelected, guess who his hero was? Me. And that was Ivy Davis for the right reasons. I'm not sure I would have done it if Ivy hadn't told me that. He didn't tell me about Jimmy Carter, but he said that's just a principle you need to remember. It's the thing you ought to do. Help the guy when he's down, and it'll do you good and help him too. And he was right. Now I don't think you see much of that today, but I don't know.
Well, you mentioned earlier, talking about sort of a change in temperament or a change in perspective in terms of government. Some people, political scientists, sociologists, historians, have argued that with Jimmy Carter and then with George Busby, you had sort of a shift away from what you would call good time Charlie Southern politicians to managerial, sort of business-focused administrative government.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter, if you recall, rearranged the entire group of departments and simplified them. And I think that probably in history will say that's the best thing he did. I don't think he was a particularly financially astute man. I think he was not real approachable, but one of the great things that we can talk about was Jimmy Carter at the end. Let's face it, he was a Georgian and he was president of the United States, and you should think in terms of office rather than the man in some levels. And so when he was building his library, Ovid Davis was charged with talking to the Coca-Cola bottlers, saying that he's going to build that library, and he's out, he's not, but you need to support him because it's a Georgia thing. And so we did, and as a result, I got put on his board of advisors, and in about 2 weeks, I'm going to the 30th anniversary, and I'm one of probably 4 or 5 people who are still on that original board, and I treasure that membership. And that's Democrat as deep as you can get, and that's okay. I'm living with it. I see a lot of my good friends there. Dot what's her name, who wrote a book about the Peanut Brigade and no money, and a lot of great friends. So in the Coca-Cola business, Daddy used to say, he said, I can't tell where that nickel that we came from, white guy, black guy, a Republican, a Democrat, a Yankee, or a Southern. I don't know. And so we were kind of neutral, almost to the point of being criticized to some point by not being as forceful in some ways politically. But we backed our people. We backed people and gave them money, and we didn't back people that we thought were dishonest or not smart enough to do the job. And there were a lot of those. There were a lot of they got winnowed out fairly quick. 1 or 2 would escape and get elected, but we didn't feel dishonest with the way we would support people. But we were also pretty astute. We thought about it.
There was a book written back in the 1940s called Who Runs Georgia? It was written by Calvin Keitel and James McKay, former Congressman James McKay. And the contention was that business in Georgia, big business in Georgia, had played a very strong hand in shaping policy and helping people get elected.
You don't say.
I don't say. Do you think that's true today?
No, I don't think it's true today, but it sure was true through the 50s and 60s, maybe going back earlier. I can tell you some instances. At one time, I'm going to say all through the 60s and 70s and maybe into the 80s before Mr. Woodruff and some others. When people like Harley Branch of Georgia Power Company and Mr. Woodruff and Jimmy Robinson, the Trust Company of Georgia people, and 2 or 3 other folks sat down at the table, that's what was going to happen. Those people had the money, they had the power. Fortunately for Georgia, they were good, honest men. And it may have been governance by fiat, it may have been governance by a committee of emperors, I don't know how you describe it. But I want to digress for just a second and talk about something that occurred to me back when I was president of the State Chamber of Commerce, and having been on red carpet tours and was a little bit.
Now, what year were you State Chamber?
President, 1981.
Okay.
By going on the red carpet tours, which I did go to 7 or 8 of them, I can't remember, and dealing with people from Japan and Germany and having spent all that time in the Far East, and I had a bit of a broader attitude than I had earlier. And it became readily apparent to me that Georgia was in competition with not only the surrounding states, but we were competing with the people from Korea, Ireland, Italy, everywhere. And then when Joe Frank Harris was governor, we had some meetings, and here was what I said. And I said it in some meetings to some derision by some of the folks who are in there. I said, what you got to understand is that right now, at that time, we're primarily in competition with the 6 or 8 southeastern states. That is Tennessee, Alabama, North and South Carolina, Florida, Alabama. And if you think about us, you got to think about Atlanta. Atlanta. Well, let me tell you something, friend. Suppose you lived in Tennessee. I know people who are prominent people in Knoxville, and I know some more people prominently in Nashville, and they don't know each other. Much less, they don't even know where Memphis is. Go to North Carolina, and you can get a good fist fight between Raleigh, Durham, and Charlotte. South Carolina, back in those days, was probably considered a figment of somebody's imagination. They didn't have anything. Florida is a state, they say, the further north, the more southern you get. Can you imagine what the state legislature talks about when Miami wants a bridge and so does Jacksonville? Alabama, Birmingham, Montgomery, now lately Mobile, and now even Huntsville. I could go on and on and on. In Georgia, what's the town? Is there any question in anybody's mind that Atlanta is it? I don't care what Columbus says. I don't care what Macon says. Savannah will stand up and pour us another Bloody Mary or something and say this is where. Atlanta, in Rome, Georgia, if Atlanta is not perfect, I don't care what we do. We're not going anywhere. You make Atlanta perfect, I would improve on the football teams and basketball teams, but at least we got first-class sports and now soccer. Atlanta has got the finest, biggest airport in the world. You got crossing rail, you got crossing interstates, you got the biggest airport in the world. Make Atlanta perfect, because without that, we don't have a chance in Rome. We will live off of some of their spillover, people who want to be near Atlanta and in Georgia, but not quite there. And look what's happened. Georgia is outpacing all the rest of these guys because Atlanta's perfect. Now, that doesn't suit a lot of folks, but it's the truth. You need to think about that. That means 4-lane highways, interstates, it means domes, it means soccer stadiums, it means everything that you can think of. it means Georgia Tech, it means Georgia State. Those things have got to be perfect, or poor little old Rome, Georgia's not going to get anything. Macon and Columbus and the rest of them are going to starve to death eventually if Atlanta's not perfect. I believe strongly in that.
So basically, you're talking about a pro-growth economic, a pro-growth, a pro-Atlanta message in terms of infrastructure,
Absolutely.
construction, business, development.
Absolutely.
Is there much of a difference between Republicans and Democrats in Georgia when it comes to economic development?
From a state level, no, I don't think there is. Some of the Democratic leaders in the state of Georgia, unfortunately for the perception, is it looks like the Democratic Party has become a black party, and the leadership is primarily black. There's some great white folks down there. This girl, Adams, is that her name? Adams. There's an Abrams and
there's Stacey Abrams and Stacey Evans.
Evans,
which is
the
not
Evans girl
confusing
is
at
a
all.
bright girl who's white. And I'm not being pro-white in this. What I'm saying is that if the Democratic Party becomes a black party, it's probably wrong to say this, but they will have segregated themselves. The black community would be very wise if they would adopt and get in the Republican Party and take some leadership positions, because then you'd find some of this rancor between the parties disappear, because wait a minute, we're attacking our own people. But if it becomes a black-run party, it's awfully easy for people with ulterior motives to make hay of that issue, and it's probably not the smartest thing to do. But now, to answer your specific question, do I see much difference? Actually, I really don't. I think on some of the issues that have been so prominent in the state of Georgia, like prison reform, the Republicans and the Democrats both pretty much sitting on the same side. It's been mishandled, and they're correcting it. I think that basically the Democrats in the state of Georgia, I go back to people like Tom Murphy. Tom Murphy was to the right of most Republicans, and yet when you mention Republican Tom Murphy, he'd jump up and scream and call you a communist or something such that. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot in this perceptions of what's going on. But the differences come when the party voting goes along party lines, which to me is the dumbest thing to tell me that just because I'm a Republican and there's 70% or 65% of the body that we all agree on every issue. There's no way I agree that much with it. On the other hand, here's the 35% of whatever it is of Democrats, and yet I wouldn't vote with any of them. That's dumb. They do a lot of things I think are pretty smart. Why, if I were over here and I voted with them, I'd be castigated? Or if I was a Democrat, said, that's a pretty good idea these guys got. The dumbest thing, it's the dumbest thing I've seen in Georgia politics, nation politics. And that was not the way it was working 40, 50 years ago when I was active in it. I'm not near as active as I once was.
You talked about Speaker Murphy, how you couldn't really get to the right sometimes with Speaker Murphy on issues. And you also mentioned Joe Frank Harris, a North Georgia governor, one of the first since the Civil War, a very conservative individual. How did somebody like Joe Frank Harris, a concrete construction man from Cartersville, Georgia, how was he able to win the Democratic nomination and then become governor in 1982?
We had an airplane in those days. And Joe Frank, I'd known him since he was a legislator from Cartersville. It was our business to know those guys, but also I'd used him to pave some lots over there, and he was a young guy to come by, and well, we so many yards and whatever. This was, and is, to this day, probably the most straight arrow Christian what you see is what you get government we've ever had. I am a great admirer of Joe Frank and Elizabeth Harris. But anyhow, one day with our airplane, you can't do this nowadays, but in those days we'd be flying to Valdosta. There was a meeting in Savannah, and I will forget it. And I said, well, come on, Joe Frank, we'll fly you down there and you can speak to our bottler group because they got a meeting down there. And he did. And I don't know if he'll see this. I hope he's not offended when I tell this story, but Joe Frank got up in front of, I introduced him, I was the introducer, and I introduced him to 300 Coke, soft drink bottlers, Pepsi guys, Coke, a whole bunch. And within about 4 or 5 minutes, he had half of them asleep. Joe Frank was not a dynamic speaker. Sorry, Joe Frank. But he had one genius thing going for him. When he got through speaking, he said, my wife Elizabeth wants to say a word or two. She got up and I saw her in 4 minutes capture that whole crowd. Elizabeth was his magic potion, and she was a great girl. The interesting thing, when Joe Frank became Harris, and Joe Frank Harris became governor, and many people will say that he was Tom Murphy's hand-picked guy, because Tom Murphy, I think it was Bo Yen that had made Tom mad. I'm not sure that I remember that all totally correct. And it may be some truth to that, because Tom Murphy had an inordinate amount of power. But to digress on Tom Murphy for just a minute, I remember when Tom retired as Speaker, got beat, and I remember saying to a lot of my friends, you guys are going to miss him. Oh, he's terrible. Tom Murphy's just an old two-bit politician. I said, you guys are going to miss him. That guy controlled your legislature, and it's going to be a dogfight down there. And it still is. Tom Murphy was a great man. He had that way of making you think he was a dumbbell, and he wasn't. I knew him well. Tom was down in Harrison. He was in Carrollton, Coca-Cola plant territory, so we sort of paid a little attention to Tom. He was a powerful guy. I like Tom. And he was straight air. He's the guy that built the dome. He's the guy that advocated the highways through Atlanta. And he didn't want anybody to know it because he thought it would look bad. But he understood what I was saying about fixing Atlanta, because Harrison County wasn't going to get anything if we didn't. So he paved 27 highway up and down because he wanted his road paved. That's fine with me. We like that idea.
So we've talked about Joe Frank Harris, Speaker Murphy, Zell Miller,
one of my all-time heroes. We were on
another North Georgia.
Oh yeah, we were on a red carpet tour, and the speakers were the Lieutenant Governor and Congressman Doug Bernard from Augusta. And so I had a bus. I had a little big green bus our company did, and they had a driver. And so we would go to Milledgeville and all these places in a week. It was a pre-legislative forum, wasn't a red carpet tour, and Zell was asked. So when we would get through, let's say, Milledgeville at 8:30 at night, having been to a dinner and fried chicken, we'd get in the back of the bus, and two of the secretaries, Doug, myself, and Zell, and might have been a little sipping going along, as we would ride to the next town to get in the motel so we could get up and go to a breakfast meeting the next morning. Well, that happened for 2 weeks straight. Zell did not imbibe, by the way, we all know that, but everybody else did. And we were having a night. I really got to know Zell, and I told him one night, I said, Zell, I'm going to tell you one thing. If you ever decide to run for governor, I'm your man. I'm from North Georgia. He said, I'm not. I'm going to be lieutenant governor, if the longest serving lieutenant governor, and was, in the history of this country, and on and on and on. Oh, well, Zell, I'm sure going to vote for you if you ever do, thinking I was safe. 2-3 years later, Marty Pingreek called me up. Frank, do you remember what you told the governor on the bus that night? I said, Marty, I'm your man. I'm for Zell, all the way. One of my very best friends in this world, who should be nameless, but a very successful billionaire real estate developer, in Atlanta. And I called him up and I said, I need a little help, need a little money for Zell. That guy's a two-bit mountain politician. I can't vote for him. I don't know who he voted for, but anyhow, he got elected. About 2 years, he called me up. He said, Frank, I apologize. You were right. Zell's the best governor we've ever had. And he says, I'm not going to run but one time. I'm not going to do it. He said, we got to get him back there. And we're raising money for a scholarship, an endowed chair at Young Harris. So Zell, who's never made any money, he's been so honest. He's not a lawyer. He can't go on off counsel with King and Spalding. And the guy doesn't know what he's going to do. If we give him an endowed chair, he'll run the second time, so he has said. We did. Zell ran and completed 4 more wonderful years. Great man, great man.
So how does the Democratic Party in Georgia go from the generations before, but Jimmy Carter, George Busby, Joe Frank Harris, Zell Miller, to winning 20% of the white vote and perennially 42 to 46% of the popular vote? What happened to Georgia Democrats? What happened to the Georgia Democratic Party?
Well, I think
since that
you got to call it what it is. It was race. And I think that there was a perception that the Republican Party was not as eagerly integrationist as was the Democratic Party. I think that on both sides that was a wrong interpretation. I don't think either party was anti-integration. I think by that time they had realized, I think the country woke up and said, what we're doing, what we've been doing is wrong. We got to quit. There are still those who hold a grudge on that and don't agree with that view, but it occurs to me that that's the ongoing view of this state and this country now. You're seeing some aberrations now, but they'll go away. I think that what happened too was that Roy Barnes, who was the guy who dropped the ball, and I liked Roy. Roy and I served on a state growth strategies commission together, and we were on the same committee. I think Roy Barnes is one of the smartest guys I ever knew. He is basically almost I won't say he was a genius, but he's smart as he can be, but seems to have the retention of everything he ever said or did, which is scary to me because I was afraid somebody's going to remember what I said, but that's neither here nor there. But anyway, Roy also, rightly or wrongly, got the reputation of being a pro-union guy. It may have been some of his defenses of unions or something, I don't really know. But Roy approached me because I was very active in the state chamber then and said, why has the chamber come out against me? And I said, Roy, I don't know that the chamber's come out against you. He said, well, a lot of their folks are not on my side. I said, Roy, they perceive you as a labor union guy, and that's just not what they want. And I don't think anybody knew Sonny Perdue. I don't think anybody really knew who the guy was. And I think that maybe the old Democratic Party, and of course you got to say that your section of the woods, Marietta, look at the growth. Where was it from? It was from the north. And they were dyed-in-the-wool Republicans, a lot of them. Well, we're sitting here and we'd been Democrats all of our life, and all of a sudden, all these people that live here are not Democrats. And we're looking around, what's going on here? I'm not sure that we knew. I had no idea, I'll be honest with you, I had no idea that Roy Barnes was going to get beat. It was as big a surprise as I've ever had in politics. I could think that and Trump, but I had no idea. I really couldn't. And I knew Sonny Perdue vaguely, not well, but I'd met him a time or two. And he seemed like a nice guy, as far as I know, still is. I'll have to be honest with you, since that happened, my political operation, I'm becoming of a certain age, and I'm not near as active as I once was. And with the activity, has not lessened my innate sense of curiosity. But it's in some ways, it's more important than it ever was. But in some other way, it makes less difference. But I got one more point I want to make, and I sense maybe. I think when we look at the problems that we have in this country today, and what I'm fixing to say may come back to haunt me, but where the big mistake was made, the huge mistake was made, was in 1866, not 1862. It was in 1866, and that's when our black folks were freed, which they should have been. We knew that. What we should have done, and had the South, not so much the South, but the North too, had they had any sense, they would have started educating those people right then. You would have had, and again, this may be subject to some criticism, you would have had, how many generations between then and now? 50? I don't know. Generations of well-educated people. But you didn't. You took these people who could barely speak English, who couldn't read and write, and said, okay, go do something. What did they do? They didn't know what to do. I often use the simile. My great-grandfather was a dirt farmer. I'm not sure that he could read, probably couldn't. If he did, he read at third grade level or some such thing. And yet he survived because his father and his father before him had been dirt farmers. They understood instinctively, if I buy seed and I dig and plant it and it comes up next spring, I got to take some corn and sell it, but I got to hold on to some money because I got to buy some seed next spring. And you did that for generations. The guy was a businessman, didn't even know what the word meant. But you take 3 generations of farmers managing help, some of them slaves maybe. My people didn't have any slaves. They were too poor to have slaves. But they had folks working with them, or perhaps children. They had big families. But they knew it. They were businessmen and didn't even know it. So when my grandfather came along, this was second nature. I buy apples from somebody and sell them for a nickel. I paid 3 cents for them. There's a profit there at the end of the year. And yet that's the great disservice because we were too stupid to educate these folks going back 140 years or 50 years or whatever it is.
So you mentioned how it was a shock to you that Sonny Perdue was able to beat Roy Barnes, who had the support of the establishment, had the support of political and business establishments. Yes. Yet you'd be hard-pressed to find a more solidly Republican state than Georgia not 15 years later. How does, we've talked about, sort of why that transition's happened. What happens to change that? What would be the biggest risk to, say, the Republican Party that might imperil that, that majority?
I think if they keep on being Republicans like they are, they're their own greatest risk, just like the Democrats are.
How
I'll tell you what I really think about that, and because I'm not smart enough to understand how the Republicans and or Democrats are going to maintain their power structure, because there's so many innuendos in back there, and if I do this, they'll do that, and so I don't want to take a stand. Not sure I know all this, but what I do think is I think you're gonna find in 8 years or 16 years, you're gonna find that independence, whoever that is, and I'm one of them. I think in a lot of ways, you're gonna find some people are gonna say, we're not gonna play that game. Now, how are they gonna do that? I know that Thomas Jefferson, and more specifically George Washington, deadly opposed the idea of political parties. but it was a time whose need, I guess, occurred, and so it grew, and but none of the forefathers were advocates of political parties. They didn't think that was the thing to do. They probably were right, but they were way ahead of their time. But what's the danger in the Republican Party? I'm not sure that I could verbalize it. I think they do a lot of dumb things. What's the danger in the Democratic Party? I think they're squabbling so much among themselves, and the Republicans are too. I think that what's lacking out there, Ross Perot tried to pull it together, but he couldn't. George Wallace tried to pull it together, but he was all wrong in his speech. But there's probably going to be maybe a third party who's going to say, you know, I'm neither to the left nor to the right. These people are both crazy. I'm a center. And I think that's where we are as a country. That's where I am. I'm neither far left nor far right. I'm probably more to the right than I am to the left. But I think the country is more to the right than they are to the left. And recent elections have shown that. And the national election was an aberration. And I won't say it was a mistake at all. I'm just saying it was what it was. But if you look at the local houses, representatives, governorships, there's the senator from up, the congressman from up in Massachusetts, right? All politics is local. Well, what's happening is the conservative element is taken over in the countryside. And that's why there's so many Republican governors, so many Republican state houses, and so many Republican congressmen. And that's where the Tom Graves, our congressman, meets the road. Now, he's at the Rotary Club listening to me fuss about telephone calls. I told Tom the other day, I said, you know, don't worry about ISIS and Korea. Let's do something that really matters. Stop these dadgum telephone calls that come through all the time.
Politically, you know, our demographics and changing demographics, destiny in terms of Georgia politics.
Well, I'm not much of an expert on those kind of things, but if your word, the demographics are correct, it's going to be a majority in this state in 8 years, maybe 16, I don't know, because the feet are on the ground. And that's going to be more Hispanic, interestingly enough, from what I can determine, than black. It's probably incorrect and unfair to attach any significance or prognostications on the basis of race, creed, or color, but it appears to me that we're moving towards a democratically controlled state, and there are two or three things that I find frightening a little bit about that, is because I'm not really sure that that's going to be the best thing for the state, and this would be perhaps politically incorrect to say this, but the people that we're talking about are probably economically on the lower end of the scale and the ones who will be hurt most about it. My hope is that the demagoguery would be a word, demagoguery, that the sale of swinging to the Democratic Party, which I'm not so sure would be good for business expansion, and yet it would be sold to people on somehow or another that's best for them. I happen to choose not to think that. I think that a business, pro-business, which generally speaking would be a Republican thing, which is maybe in some ways a little harsher to get to, but in the long run is far more productive from a job creation point of view. Having said that, would be a general statement. I can't back it up with any facts because I don't know what I'm talking about. But when you start talking about where is Georgia going to be 10 or 15 or 18 years from now, I think Georgia's done some of the smartest things that any state has done. The Georgia Research Alliance, which was a creation of Zell Miller and some of his things, which is a plan by which scholarships or money is paid to eminent scientists, eminent scholars they're called, on one or three or four major fields: biology, environmental, and one, two more. But anyway, where you go out here and get the best there is, regardless of the cost, and put them at Emory or Georgia or Morehouse, or I think there's 6 colleges involved. I was on that board many years ago, so I've kind of forgotten some of the things. But they're creating now over $500 million in grant money outside of the state sent into Georgia with the efforts of those eminent scholars. The program's been going on for 30 years or so now. I think that is going to bear more fruit than we can imagine, because it's scientific in nature, it's research in nature, and I think you got that to look forward to. Some of the things like the driverless cars are going to change the dynamics of this state. There is a strong field of thought there that your roads are going to become overbuilt at some point in time. I don't see that happening, because the driverless car, unless it hurries up, the need for bigger roads is going to go first, and then the driverless cars are going to come along. And when that happens, you may see as much as I don't know, I've read different numbers, 25 or 30% decrease in traffic. And if that happens, because the car will come to Rome and stay there till somebody's ready to go to Atlanta, but the car will run 24 hours a day. That would be utopia, of course, and I don't know that I'll see that in my lifetime, but I think that's going to happen. I think the Georgia education system, which is more and more getting better and better. Even our high school dropout rate, which has gone from somewhere in the low to mid 70s up to somewhere in the 85, and in some instances, I know of a high school that's got a 92% graduation rate. That's from freshman to graduation. We could talk a lot about remedial education in colleges, because some of these high schools are not prepared. And it could be that there's a little bit of grade inflation going on. University of Georgia's SATs and ACT numbers this year are off the chart. They're getting some brilliant kids over there. That payoff is probably 20 years down the road till those kids really bring what they got to the table. But it's out there. And as I was in conversation with some school people, school superintendent here not long ago, and we talked about the smart kids. You know, the smart kids, the high ACT kids that are over at Athens, you don't need to worry about those kids. You could stand in front of the college with a 420 gauge shotgun and you couldn't stop them, because they're coming in there and they're going to get an education. There's probably in our high schools, and this is a huge waste of money in order to be politically correct, we've got kids in those high schools, they can't get a diploma, they can't read, they're not able to read, they're handicapped in one way or other, and this perhaps a school, and yet the system says they got to be in high school. They don't belong there. It's not their fault. There has to be another place for them. What it is, I'm not smart enough to know. But what you do when you take these smart kids on one end and the uneducatable ones on the other end, you got 65% in the middle. That's where we need to be spending our money. Because in that group, you got a bunch of them that could go either way. They could just say, you know, this is not worth it. I don't like what I'm doing. Wait a minute, let's counsel you, son. Let's sit down and talk about it, young lady, that your pay throughout your life is going to be double if you get a high school diploma versus what you're fixing to do, whatever the numbers are. And then you got the upper end of that crowd that all they need is a little bit of mentoring, where they could be one of those top 10% and walk in the University of Georgia in Athens, or Harvard, or Yale, or any of the great colleges of this world, of this country. We're being foolish in handling our education system, and the tragedy is the cost financially is huge, and it's unconscionable, but the loss in human talent is where the great loss is, and we're not addressing that as we should. Part of this, in my view, is because of the political situation with state boards of education and the state board of education. I think some things need to be done in that. I think the bureaucratic view of it's always been done that way has really overcome the intelligence of let's try something that looks pretty good. I'm an optimist on that, but I can be a little pessimistic because I don't see it happening as fast. Insofar as the state of Georgia itself is concerned, we've probably got the best highway system in the United States. Every time we get measured against any other state, our maintenance and our interstate roads come up right at the top. We vary from the top, the best, to the third or fourth, but you go up to some of these other states and ride around, you'll see what they're talking about. The potholes are bigger than you are. I think Georgia's attitude of the political bodies, and I don't exclude Democrats or Republicans. I think both sides have been sensible enough to make Georgia a business-friendly state. And I think even states like Michigan are advertising it's a business-friendly state. And if there was ever a non-business, unfriendly state 15 years ago, look what they did. They drove the automobile industry to Mexico and Canada. If they'd been a little smarter, they probably could have kept some of that industry, but they weren't. I think Georgia is smart enough to try and see those stumbling blocks that are sitting out there and hopefully avoid them. I am just bullish as I could be about the state of Georgia. I think that if I lived anywhere in the United States, I'd say that's a pretty good place to live. The climate's pretty good. We get a little hot, but we get a little chilly too. The people are friendly. And you talk about the demographics, where are we going? Where folks with my color skin are going to be in the market? That doesn't bother me. I will not lose 10 seconds of sleep for several reasons. First, it is what it is, and it doesn't make any difference. And it will be a very gradual sort of a thing, and we'll live with it. So that's just not even on my radar as something to worry about. I don't think it makes any difference. It's going to be, my gosh, the Hispanic community in 10 years, in another generation, are going to be our grandchildren's sweethearts. And so be it. I can't find a lot of problems with any of this sort of stuff. So I guess my bottom line, again, as I said, was I'm very bullish on Georgia. I think we got it put together. I think the political situation is good. I don't see any rattlesnakes out there in the political population right now. I think we got some pretty good folks running for governor. I got my own preferences, but they're whatever you want to call them.
All right. Well, do you have anything you'd like to add before we finish up?
Oh, I don't know. I'll probably think of something in the middle of the night, but right now it's been a lot of fun. I think there's nothing more fun than reminiscing back about politics because it's been such a huge part of Georgia life. I think Georgians always have loved politics. Georgia takes to politics like duck to water, and we like to talk about it and gather around and have a libation and argue about who's best and who's not and what do you think's going to happen.
Well, I've certainly enjoyed our talk today. On behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia, thank you, Mr. Barron, for participating in our new two-party Georgia oral history program. Really do appreciate it.
You're mighty welcome. Anytime.